Now we'll turn to broader government, legal, and policy views of facial recognition. At this point, I could have chosen things from all over the world. I tend to collect these articles, and just in the last year, there have been new articles about India and France greatly increasing its use of facial recognition, of the United States and various places having new policies that are banning or restricting facial recognition. I chose a couple of articles from Europe, in part because it showed that even within one geographical region, there's a variety of approaches. So the first article is about the European Union and the fact that it's considering, not yet implementing, greater restrictions on facial recognition. The article really looks at things from the point of view of surveillance and starts by saying that people who are interested in data protection feel that scanning faces without the consent of the people who are being scanned violates what's known as GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a very well-known regulation that is the one that looks at privacy issues related to data in general. And when we talked about the right to be forgotten, that falls under GDPR. So these people argue that taking facial measurements is no different than taking biometric data such as fingerprints. And you couldn't just walk up to somebody and take their fingerprints without having a cause to do so. And they argue that the same should be true of facial recognition measurements. And of course, this is linked to issues of police use. Now, this was just a discussion in progress, and it came from about a year and a half ago. So as I was recording this, I looked back to see if there were any policies that have been implemented since then. And it seems like not yet. And in fact, it's clearly a discussion that has been actively underway. It's not clear that it's leading to policies in the near term, but it's clearly an issue of great interest. I think something that this points to, particularly if your perspective is coming from a different part of the world than Europe, is that once you get to the policy and legal issues related to facial recognition, or many other things that we've talked about in this course, they depend on the culture and, in many cases, the nation. In many cases, you could oversimplify it and say, as we've said before, it depends on the weighting between security and privacy. So for instance, if you look at just a few big players, in China, there is quite overwhelming use of facial recognition and clearly a weighting towards security more than privacy. Europe tends to be at the other end of that spectrum. The weighting tends to go more towards privacy than security. The United States, I suspect, is somewhere in between. The United Kingdom is an interesting example of those national or regional differences. It tends to weight things considerably more in the security direction than other countries in Western and Central Europe. There are various theories about this. A lot of people think it dates back to the great violence and insecurity that came with the issues in Northern Ireland some decades ago, and some of which have persisted. And so for that reason, I selected the second article about the United Kingdom to illustrate some of those differences in perspectives. So as the article mentions, and has come up once before, London has the most cameras of any city in the world outside of China, and for that matter, aside from Beijing. This article says that London has a little over 400,000 cameras. It wasn't written that long ago, but I just looked online, and the estimate that is there now is that London has somewhat over 600,000 cameras. Now, many of those cameras were installed before the advent or the use of facial recognition, but now many, if not all of them, are linked to it. And so the article starts out with the example of facial recognition being used to scan the crowd, presumably for some security reasons, before the national rugby game between Wales and Ireland. And it says that it actually identified somebody who was a suspected criminal, and that person was arrested, I think, before the game. So the basic question is that type of use of facial recognition desirable because perhaps it keeps all of us safer, aside from the person who got arrested? Or is it something that is an entire invasion of privacy or somewhere in between? Let me give you a little personal perspective on this, partly for fun and partly for real. I've actually attended one of those national rugby matches in the United Kingdom. This one was when I was in my 20s. It was actually between Scotland and England in Edinburgh. And actually, as a total aside, it was with friends who were from that town of East Hagborn that was virtual background a couple of lessons ago. And I can tell you that they're, even though I was behaved perfectly, I'm sure, they're not sedate affairs. And so let's say you have facial recognition at those, and they're simply taking records of people's behavior. Would you like the record of your behavior to then be available to any employer 20 years down the road? Those are some of the sorts of issues that come up on one end of this discussion. On the other end, and much more seriously, I think a lot of the installation of these things in London have been in public transport because there were these horrible bombings in public transport. So if facial recognition allows police authorities to detect a known terrorist before that terrorist is able to do something awful, is that desirable? I think it's probably a different answer than the one about the rugby match. Or, having just said that, maybe not. I'm just actually trying to stir up discussion by making comments like that. The final thing that I would ask, and as you think about, is this what you think is the desirable or right use of facial recognition or not? How much is it tied to the accuracy? Again, the article mentions that there was a case at a national air show where facial recognition was used on 21,000 people, and 7 of them were found to match what's called a watch list. This is a list of people that the authorities are looking for some reason, but 4 of those were incorrect. Does that impact things? Does it impact things if those incorrect people are quickly or realize that it's incorrect and nothing more happens? Does it impact things if there are no errors and all of these are correct? As a final comment, this leads to the entire issue of watch lists and how they should be used. But that's part of this article, but it's probably farther outside the domain of this course. Related to that, it also lists the issue of how long do we keep all this data? If we're doing facial recognition and collecting these databases, do we keep them forever, or are there limits? And are there rules and restrictions to that? I don't think that's an area that's established at this point, but it's certainly an area that is going to come up and that we're going to be concerned with. Briefly, I also have a second optional article on the list about the UK, just to show that there, as in most places, there are various points of view, and that there's at least one fairly recent court case in the UK that went much more to the privacy side, that showed concerns about the gender and racial issues with facial recognition, the biases, I should have said, as well as the controls that are or aren't in place for facial recognition. I should mention once more that we're not doing any or many concrete ethical analyses using our ethical frameworks during this module. As I said before, the reason for that is that this really comes down to how you weight security versus privacy. And these frameworks are excellent at giving us bases to think about those things, but don't give us a definitive answer to which is more, and that may depend on values. Both security and privacy could likely be considered virtues, and so just a virtue analysis alone is not going to do it. And again, if you looked at utilitarian, you have to arbitrarily put weights on what counts for how much. And so again, it would come down to how much do you weight the security part, how much do you weight the privacy part? And of course, there's plenty of aspects that go deeper or finer grain than that. But so again, it gives us a framework to think about things. It doesn't give us a definitive right or wrong. Before we get to the discussion board where you get to voice and debate opinions on these sorts of issues, I wanted to briefly touch on the last article about IBM announcing in the summer of 2020 that for at least now, it was entirely getting out of the facial recognition business. So the CEO of IBM, Arvind Krishna, made that announcement saying that IBM would not create or sell products that contain facial recognition, nor would it do research on facial recognition. I'll quote from his statement. It's an interesting one. It says, IBM firmly opposes and will not condone uses of any facial recognition technology, including facial recognition technology offered by other vendors for mass surveillance, racial profiling, violations of basic human rights and freedoms, or any purpose which is not consistent with our values and principles of trust and transparency. We believe now is the time to begin a national dialogue on whether and how facial recognition technology should be employed by domestic law enforcement agencies. So if you read this, it sounds more like an indefinite timeout than it does we'll never touch this again, but it's still a very interesting and influential development. And at roughly the same time, both Microsoft and Amazon have announced much more limited actions, saying that they temporarily will not sell facial recognition systems to the police. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out over time, but clearly these major technology companies, like governmental agencies, are very important players in the national and global discussions of this topic. So we'll conclude this lesson in this module with debate, or as close to a debate as we can get in a virtual online course environment. What I've asked you to do, and I'm going to put these instructions on the screen so you can be looking at them as I say them, is to first answer 2 questions and then comment on other people's answers. So with more specificity, the 2 questions that I've asked you to answer are first, given the current imperfect but improving state of facial recognition software, where, if at all, do you think it should and or should not be used? And second, suppose facial recognition improved to a point where identifications are nearly flawless. Then, where, if at all, do you think it should and or should not be used? In answering each question, please consider at least 2 potential uses of facial recognition, such as police identification of people sought for questioning, government identification of suspected potential terrorists, or perhaps more benign applications like professors taking attendance in large lectures. And I should say as an aside, even though I haven't mentioned that, that is one of the uses of facial recognition that comes up in at least one of the articles that I looked at. Finally, to complete the assignment wording, after you've completed your answers, please write a response to at least 1 answer to each of the 2 questions, or a response that somebody else has already made, stating what you agree or disagree with those answers or responses. So that came out a little bit clumsy, but basically I'm asking you to look at an answer or a response to an answer and respond to that, and do that at least twice. And as I say, finally, please feel free to voice both agreement and or disagreement, but to do so in a way that is respectful to the opinions being voiced and to the people who are voicing them. Thanks.